by far, psychology's biggest bang experiment on what I just said, those social influences, is on the topic of obedience to authority. I'll do it by a particular historical case that is the historical case that preceded this experiment. But the general issue is that whatever one thinks of the uses of militaries by national governments, many times with good rationalization, other times we question it, they often become a case study of obedience to authority, where people who, in no setting other than the one they're in, the military one, would ever harm somebody else, but when receiving an order from a national authority will do so. Obviously, it seems natural. Yet, that occurs even in a super extreme case. How long ago is it? Do people know who Eichmann is, or is this now in a world of obscurity? During the Nazi reign in Germany, Eichmann was a very high-ranking Nazi official who was in charge of, I believe, the highest, most in-charge person of the logistics of the death camps, of getting people transported from their homes and from one place in Europe to a Nazi death camp for extermination. Eichmann, after, this is just like a classic prototypic war era kind of depiction of what people expected to see Eichmann being. What they expected to see was some monstrous figure who had overseen the logistics of the extermination of millions of people based merely on their religious background throughout World War II. So you kind of expect, when you see at least as hideous an act as we have in recorded history, that there'll be some matching person who's sort of equally hideous. For quite a while, nobody did see Eichmann because he managed to escape from Germany, I believe, to Argentina at the very late stages of the war, and was identified only in 1960 by the Israeli Secret Service, who found him and brought him to trial. When Eichmann shows up at trial, he's that guy. It's almost disappointing. Did I punch up? I won't take the time to do this. I didn't punch this. You can see the films yourself. These, of course, are major historical events. The trial was filmed. Every second of the trial is filmed. So there's this trial where you can tell, it's probably good I'm not taking up time with it, but you can tell when you see the room in this film, none of the people has actually seen Eichmann once the Israeli Secret Service got him. Of course, they protected him so that he could be on trial. And so he suddenly enters the room, and everybody's expecting some, like, movie stereotype of some, warlike Nazi coming out. And some guy comes out and, looks like, science professor or accountant or something. It's sort of a disappointment to the world, as is what he says. What he essentially says, though obviously he believed in lots of the Nazi creed, but he wasn't unique there in Germany in the middle of the 20th century. Essentially, he says, he was following orders. There was a system in which, I'm just saying what he said, I'm not defending. There's a system in which the government had established a set of camps for the extermination of a part of the population that had already been set up. They needed somebody to run the logistics. He, as a member of the army, was ordered to be the person running the logistics, and therefore, all he was doing was following the orders of other authorities, and once following those orders, of course was aware that the result of following the orders was that millions of people who were being killed. But once he was in a system of following orders, it seemed like the social system, authority, responsibility that could be sent to the higher person, even though you're executing the rules, was sufficient to have this relatively normal, sane-looking person engage in this outrageous, most large-scale outrageous act that you can find in recent recorded history. So, so he's there, but I'll skip him. He looks just like that. The guy comes out in the suit, sits down. He's the guy. So a social psychologist named Stanley Milgram was well aware that there are, in a sense, two explanations for the kind of horror the world saw in World War II. One is that maybe the people executing the Nazi regime, executing with maybe it was the right word, were all just hideous, monstrous non-humans. The other is that they were relatively normal people who were following orders. This is a major historical question. Both of those may be partly correct. Milgram's suggestion, though, was that even the most ordinary, run-of-the-mill person might, in a certain situation, follow orders in which he or she essentially does the same kind of thing that people did when working for the Nazi regime, even harming and potentially killing somebody else. So what he does is to set up an experiment. How many people have seen this before in like a day? Right. This is psychology's most famous experiment, so at least a third of the room have seen this. Feel free not to just run right out of the room, or feel free also to comment as I do. What he does, if you're in the experiment, which is often the way to think about these things, imagine yourself in it, you show up for what seems like an utterly mundane experiment on learning. You and another person, who is of course a Confederate, show up for this experiment and are told by the experimenter that we're conducting, it's first run at Yale University, we're conducting here at Yale some studies on learning. In school systems, sometimes children are punished for learning, for getting things wrong when they're learning. It's possible that the punishments facilitate learning. You're told there's no good studies of that. So this is going to be an experiment in which psychologists at Yale are studying the effect of punishment on learning. One of you will be assigned to the role of teacher, and the other to the role of learner. And so they come up with a little drawing out of a hat in which you and the other person reach in, and you happen always to be assigned to the role of teacher. That's, of course, easy. They just have a hat where there's two pieces of paper. They both say teacher. So you pick it out. It says teacher. The Confederate takes out the piece of paper and says, oh, learner. And so even though it said teacher, and therefore the other person is assigned to the role of learner. What happens is that the learner goes into another room while you, the teacher, administer instructions that the learner hears. The experimenter sits there taking notes on things. And the punishments you learn are that the learner, if he or she gets something wrong, will receive an electric shock. There are 4 striking features of the experiment. First, the learner is this guy, a slightly overweight, middle-aged man who reports that he has a heart problem. The shocks aren't just like totally tiny nothing things. By the way, there aren't any real shocks, but you can't tell if you're in the experiment. What happens is there's a shock machine which still exists. It's in the Museum of Psychology, which I believe is in Akron, Ohio. That's the original machine. The shocks have indications on them of their severity. They range from slight through moderate, through strong, very strong, intense, extremely intense, danger, severe shock, and Milgram creates the label XXX as the highest level. And then, when you do the shock, you can hear the learner in the next room. Where's the learner? There he is. Worked a lot on that. But you can. The learner follows a script. Well, let's go to the film, because at this point you got a sense of this, and I sure hope I remember to punch up the film.